gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior.
And our passage is no exception. This passage certainly has much to say to the unbeliever. But remember, Paul is writing Romans to the church at Rome. This passage belongs as much to the believer as it does the unbeliever. In fact, he begins Romans in the first 5 verses, and he basically says that the purpose of my apostleship is for the obedience of faith. Did you get that? The obedience of faith. In other words, true obedience is animated by faith. It's animated by faith, hope, and love. True faith issues into God-honoring, God-glorifying obedience. Honoring and glorifying God as God, that is, in your motives. He even ends Romans in that same way. Romans 16:25, it's for the obedience of faith. Now, here's the question. How do you strengthen your faith? You strengthen it by thinking and reflecting on the mercies of God in Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what he does in this letter. The entire letter is a reflection on the mercies of God as he has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. Now, in our current passage, the passage starts off with seriousness of sin, deadly seriousness. But not just sin, the wrath of God on sin that the righteousness of God requires. So in chapter 1 of Romans, he establishes the lostness of the immoral person. The person who does not have the law but has exchanged what he understands about God for a lie. Paul says they are without excuse. They stand under condemnation. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, he considers the moral person. The person who thinks he's moral enough compared to other people. Paul says they are under condemnation. And then he gets to the religious person in Romans 2, verses 17 through 3:8, and he says the righteous person, that is, the person who is trying to establish righteousness by obedience to the law, is under condemnation. He is painting bad news, and in order to understand the good news, Paul understands you have to consider the true sinful condition. In the 90s, I used to go to Seattle, Washington, a great deal. And it always amazed me as you begin to make your descent into Seattle, especially in the winter, it's always these dark, ominous rain clouds. And I would always wonder, why did I leave the South? I left the South for this. But all of a sudden, protruding through those dark, ominous rain clouds, it's one of the most majestic things you've ever seen in your life. A 14,000-foot snow-covered mountain, Mount Rainier. In fact, it's the dark, ominous rain clouds that makes that mountain that much more majestic and glorious. By peering at that mountain through the backdrop of those dark, ominous rain clouds, you marvel at its glory and its beauty. You can't understand, you can't marvel at the gospel unless you understand the human condition. And so in verses 19 and 20, Paul summarizes the human condition. He says in verse 19, now, we know that whatever the law says, it says to those under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may become guilty before God. He is summarizing everything he has said thus far. As he said in Romans 10, there is none righteous, none. There is none who understands. There's none who seeks after God. They have all gone out of the way. They have together become unprofitable. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And that's what he establishes here, the universal human guilt of man. Now, a few weeks ago, I was on the road and my wife was taking care of our 4 children. I've been traveling a little bit this semester. And she said that she had put our 4 children down. And just recently, we put our 3-year-old boy into the room with our 5-year-old boy. They had their own rooms, until about a month ago. So a month ago, they began to share a room. And so it went from having one sinner in the room to two sinners in the room. But now there's 4 times the sin. The math doesn't add up. But she had put them down. They had been down for about an hour. There was school the next day. They were supposed to be asleep. And she started hearing this noise, loud noise. So she begins to make her way to their room. She opens up the door. It's pitch dark and it is quiet. It is still. She knows something isn't right. She heard that noise after all. But then she noticed over there that their closet door was closed and there was a light coming out from underneath the door. And so she walked over to the closet door, opened it up, and there were my 2 boys, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they were just sitting there reading a book together. Well, they can't read. They were looking at pictures together. And when they saw their mom, their jaws dropped. They were silenced. And they sat there for a minute looking at their mother, guilty before their mother. They had no excuse. And then my son Nate looked at her and said, "We are scared of you." He knew he was guilty. That's exactly what it will be in that day. That's exactly what it will be in that day. There will be no excuses. There will be no victims. Your jaw will drop, and you will acknowledge and concede your guilt before the God who is the judge of all the earth. That's what he's establishing here. Verse 20, "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." All the law can do is serve as a mirror to show you how nasty, how sinful you are before a holy God. Now, when you get up in the morning, you go and look in the mirror, and you see that you need to brush your teeth and brush your hair and wash, but the mirror can't do that, does it? It just reveals that you need this done, okay? That's exactly what the law does. Now, this creates a dilemma, though. It creates an exceeding dilemma because God has graciously determined to save a people. Yet Paul is saying here, all people are condemned. Now, here's the question. How can a God who is infinite, eternal, unchangeable in his being, in his wisdom, in his power, in his holiness, in his goodness, in his justice, and in his truth, save the kind of people that Paul is describing in this passage? It's a real dilemma, isn't it? But the dilemma isn't new. This dilemma has been established as early as Genesis, but you see it even more clearly spelled out in Exodus. For instance, in Exodus 33, Moses is interceding with God, and he asks God, he says, "Show me your glory. Show me your ways." And this is what God says to him in chapter 34, verse 6. It's a wonderful passage. "The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, 'The Lord, the God who is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression." Did you get that? Forgiving iniquity and transgression, but who will by no means clear the guilty. Did you get that? He forgives iniquity and transgressions, but he by no means clears the guilty. Do you get the tension? How does he forgive iniquity and transgression, and yet at the same time he does not clear the guilty?